recall from the last video on sound, the way in which we kind of talked about diegetic sound versus non-diegetic sound as this hard and fast distinction between these two zones. In this video, what we're going to try to do is very slowly start to break apart that hard distinction. We're still going to talk about these two terms, diegetic versus non-diegetic, but our examples are going to blur the boundaries between them, and that's not a bad thing. It's a way of getting into a more nuanced discussion of sound poetics in cinema without throwing away this vocabulary. And Michel Chion is going to be a helpful guide here. He's the author of a piece of writing that I asked you to read, an essay called The Audiovisual Scene, in which he explains something I find rather useful. He says, in a sense, that diegetic versus non-diegetic do not say cleanly describe everything in cinema, and that's okay. He says it this way. He says, in recent years, the distinction on-screen, off-screen, non-diegetic has often been denounced as obsolete and reductive. Critics have problematized it with increasing fervor because of the exceptions and special cases it doesn't seem to account for. For example, where we situate sounds, usually voices that come from electrical devices located in the action and that the image suggests or directly shows, and what to do with a character who speaks with her back to us, so we don't actually see her speak. Is her voice acousmatic? In other words, off-screen? Why reject a valuable distinction simply because it isn't absolute? These distinctions are analogous to zones among which one finds many shadings, degrees, and ambiguities. So that last line is really important for what we're going to do today, is look at examples in which we can think about diegetic and non-diegetic, or on-screen versus off-screen sound, as these zones with various degrees and shadings and ambiguities. And that is actually a good thing, and it makes the poetics of sound all that more interesting and complex. So Chion's kind of guide for this is to create a diagram in which to locate three main categories: that which is off-screen, that which is non-diegetic, and that which is on-screen. He will categorize these three into two larger categories: acousmatic zones and visualized zones. This is not so important for us, but it's just making a distinction between things that we see, that is this zone, and things that we don't see, that is this zone. So just to kind of get you in the habit of thinking in this kind of seemingly abstract way, but in a way that I think is quite useful, let's return to that opening example from before. Right? So right now we are watching a film in which we see a person and we hear music. We can actually track the, say, change of the music along this diagram in time as the image changes. So right now the music is clearly in the realm of the non-diegetic. Right? It sounds like a musical score. So we're hovering here, we're hovering here. It's still here in our minds. And as soon as I start to realize that that band on screen is the source of it, the music has literally changed to on-screen sound. But here's actually the most important part of the scene in my eyes, is this part. When the music is happening now, it is neither non-diegetic music nor on-screen music. It is off-screen diegetic music. We don't see the source anymore, and yet it has changed by virtue of what the scene has introduced to our eyes. That is the kind of complexity that this diagram is going to help us unlock. It's not all that different from the way we talk about off-screen space, right? Remember that sequence from *Inglourious Basterds*, that the space that we saw was transformed by virtue of seeing what was below it, right? I hope that we get a similar thing going on here. So let's look at some examples where certain kinds of categories get blurred, right? So we called a sound bridge last time a situation in which, when we're at the beginning of one scene, the sound from the previous scene carries over briefly before the sound from the new scene begins. There is a stretching of this term in Marie Antoinette.
Madame, you have fulfilled our wishes and those of France. You are the mother of a dauphin. May I present?
So I'm going to lower the sound just to take stock of what we're seeing and hearing. Right? We're hearing diegetic sounds, but we're getting a nice kind of melancholic score to accompany what we are seeing.
Un dauphin! Un dauphin! Un dauphin! What is wrong?
Notice something slightly has changed. There is a lot less diegetic sound and the music has gotten louder. We've kind of almost transitioned into a montage sequence without really announcing itself as such. Here's the moment where things radically change, or at least they should confuse our terms, right? What has happened in some sense is that the non-diegetic music has become diegetic, right? We have located the source of that music here at the opera. So you'll recall this is the scene in which we repeat that kind of thing that happened earlier in the film, where she stands up and claps and everyone joins her despite it being a infelicitous gesture. Here, she does the same thing and no one continues, suggesting that her influence has waned considerably. And now here at this moment in this continuing sequence, we have probably the most complex version of the sound. Right? The sound started as non-diegetic, was revealed itself to be diegetic, thereby maybe being a kind of extended sound bridge, right? If we can think of these things as two different scenes. And then the music stopped, right? Because the opera ended, and then the sound continued, right? And it didn't just continue in the next shot, it actually continued in the same sequence, in the same space. Right? And so as you watch the scene, the sound, the music will continue, and it kind of contains these levels of meaning, right? It is both a piece of music through which Marie might have this negative memory, right? This moment when she clapped and no one followed her, but it also itself functions very, very usefully as a melancholic kind of minor key piece of music to accompany this very dark and somber part of the film. So we're going to look at a new term as an example of blurring the zones between diegetic and non-diegetic even further. The term is Mickey Mousing. It's a term obviously that's referring to the tradition of Disney films. Basically it's the idea of over-illustrating the action in a scene through the score. It's what happens when a person is, say, moving in a particular way and the music seems to almost punctuate the beats of their movement. Fairly clear example here. Okay, so the Mickey Mousing is the fact that you get these brass notes accompanying each movement, placement of his hand on the wall. And then, as you continue to watch, the synchronicity is going to start to wane and we'll go to a more ordinary relationship between image and sound, right? So that's what a Mickey Mousing is, but conceptually what it's doing is actually blurring the boundaries between diegetic and non-diegetic. Since in a very strange way, the music seems to know or can see the action of the film in a more precise way than we're used to, right? We don't think about music as generally miming the individual gestures of a character that suggests a kind of intimate relationship between image and sound that almost makes us feel as if the music is more diegetic than we like to think of it as, right?